Here is what a terrible instrument looks like, and in general, what was done during the Sinai pilgrimage. Well, speaking about this matrix, one can also consider another. This genetically determined potential of a person, its matrix of possible states of development, is determined by the matrix of the biosphere, and it is determined by the biorhythms of the cosmos. That is, he is not alone. He lives in a multidimensional matrix, including the matrix of the biosphere and the matrix of the cosmos. And in this sense, speaking about fate, every person is born under certain oscillatory processes, as astrologers used to say. And not only are they born, even conception occurs later, not just during the union of egg cells with sperm and the biopole fields of two loving people, if they truly conceive a new person, but also those biorhythms that exist in the cosmos. That is, astrologers should take this into account, generally speaking, not only the moment of birth, but also the moment of conception of a person. This is also necessary since all these rhythms have an effect, as you can see, impact on the formation of a person. Furthermore, a person has a probabilistic predetermination in what is called fate. But this fate is not such that a step to the left or a step to the right means you can't escape. Nothing of the sort. A person can change their fate within the limits of this universal matrix. Therefore, this also needs to be known. That is, one should not think that a fortune teller predicted it, and that's it. What has been foretold to you can be changed, and fundamentally changed. It is important to be able to manage not only oneself, but also events, and it is also important to always be in dialogue with God. That's it. That is, genetically determined potential is also a certain private measure that one must fill with real content throughout life. Well, you need to build your life in such a way that what is given to you by God is mastered 100%. And now let's compare ourselves, acquaintances, and so on. Are we mastering all of this 100%? Of course not. Why? Because the entire culture does not support this. We were not given this. We did not read this. We do not know this. We do not know how to do this. And therefore, so to speak, we find ourselves in such. Moreover, what I have described is largely determined astrologically, that is, by the influence of the rhythms of the earth and the cosmos on a person. Conclusions. From what we have considered, what are they? Human abilities need to be developed in a timely manner. Again, a proverb. You see, Vaneshka did not learn. Even you will not learn. Here, again, are schools, kindergartens, parents, children's books, and other aspects of the culture in which we live. The genetic program sets strict time, norms, boundaries for the mastery of something by a person. Remember, we already discussed Mowgli. You remember I told you about Mowgli, which means when a child was raised by animals, and then when he was taken back at a young age, around 10 to 12 years old, it turns out that teaching him to speak is impossible. He is a human. He has a brain, a tongue, eyes, ears, everything. But he cannot speak. Why? Because genetics has allocated a strict time norm for a person to master something. Therefore, this moment of forming a person into adulthood is very important. That is, when he masters everything. And if there are no necessary conditions in the habitat during a certain period, it all leads to a disruption of genetically determined potential. Well, and now if you look at the children in Russia, look at how many homeless children there are, and they will enter life. And then, like Professor Dobrenkov, when Sasha and Masha were killed, if you remember, who is to blame? Well, these criminals, are they really criminals? These kids who have been thrown out onto the streets by all this culture, all these democratizers and so on, they are the result of the management of that immoral culture. I always remember a song in this sense from the movie The Generals of the Sand Quarries. Do you remember there, why did you leave me? Why, after all, I am your brother, I am a human. When you were caressing your children, I wanted to eat, I was freezing. And these people who later are indeed deprived of much, they do not know. And these wealthy ones want them to be good and accept their fate. They will never accept it. And what has formed in them, this is how they realize it in relation to Sasha Matse, Professor Dobrenkov. So can you imagine what generation is being prepared now if necessary measures are not taken? What society will it be? And so they built all these fences, prison romanticism, all these castles, you know, with spikes, with fences, with barbed wire, with towers, and with machine guns there. And is this what people are? It's some kind of nonsense, some kind of culture. That is, when people guard themselves from each other. In general, if it comes to that, we are already in the third millennium, and people are killing each other in wars and so on. This is the satanic concept we are talking about. Let's talk about national cultures. With the emergence of the species Homo sapiens in conditions of zero, or close to zero cultural level, the initial paths of development were determined by matrices of genetically conditioned potential capabilities. And here it is depicted that the Earth, well, a fragment of a planet, is conditionally described like this. This is the matrix of the development of all humanity. And what about nationalities? Well, here in Europe, let's not name them. Here is the potential in Europe. Here is the potential in Russia. And here is the potential in Japan, genetically determined potential. All of this is within the hierarchically highest encompassing management, that is, God. But the possibilities were different. This includes Gumilyov's theory, the theory of ethnogenesis, which states that the determining and sole factor in the formation of man and culture was the environment in which he lived. Yes, Lev Nikolaevich Gumilyov is right in this, that of course the environment influences the formation of a person. But if only the environment exerts influence, then Lev Nikolaevich Gumilyov deprives a person of reason, deprives the environment, deprives culture, deprives management, and so on. And that is already incorrect. And in the concept of dead water, this is detailed. For those interested, read it. But here I just wanted to say, of course, there is a difference in a person who is raised in the desert. He even, let's say, looks where beyond the horizon. What is there beyond the horizon? Those who are in the forest. He is in the forest, so there are trees. He looks where? Up to the stars. That is, the terrain does influence a person, but behavior is not determined solely by that. It is determined by the culture in which he lives, and culture is managed. So, what am I getting at? So, in this picture, the genetically conditioned possibilities were different, and the adaptation also took various paths, influenced by many factors. And in this sense, what is the difference in these matrices that existed? Look, in Japan there is the sea all around, an island. They are limited. Yes, there are mountains and so on. Now let's take Russia, and in Russia there are also mountains, and deserts, and forests, and seas, and rivers, and lakes, and fields, and plains. That is, we have. So, the possibilities in terms of formation, in terms of the measure of universal adaptation, are much greater. And therefore, the Russian language, for example, is much richer. Well, let's say, what do they call a girl in England? Gel. And that's it. But how about in Russian? Girl, little girl, young woman, maiden, and so on. What is this? These are colors, different shades. So, therefore, and then when we talked about the fact that a word is a code that reflects objective reality, which language is the richest, the most saturated? Yes, English can be used, well, as a technical language for pressing buttons on a computer, and so on, but the language that most fully and vividly reflects the entire universe is the one that carries the shades of those diversities. Well, it is stated here that these matrices themselves were not conditioned by the direct influence of the natural geographical environment, but since individuals of the species Homo sapiens developed in different areas what I have described, these matrices adapted to the local geographical conditions of the environment. Therefore, the possibilities for these matrices differed. And this predetermined the development of cultures in different regions at an early stage of development. Here is the thesis that has been considered about national cultures, but one must understand what was imposed on this. The direct influence of the natural environment, forests, mountains, seas, and so on, borrowing from other cultures, was it? It was, that is. And in this sense, what is our matrix again? We have many cultures. And why do we speak of the civilization of the world? Remember, when we considered the trinity of matter and information of the world, we talked about Western culture, Eastern culture, and Russian culture, the civilization itself. So why? Because here, in Russia, there are many peoples, many cultures. They interacted with each other, taking the best from one another. That is, it was a multicolored experience. And they borrowed all of this from each other. In this sense, Russia is like a mold of the entire planet Earth. That's what I say. And we lived in harmony with one another. And no cultures were destroyed. And in the USSR, the friendship of peoples was fostered during Stalin's time, and so on. Next, social organization. It definitely left its mark. So, there was never slavery in Russia, you know. So, outside of social governance, one must also consider hierarchically the highest, that is, God's governance in relation to all of this. And so, ultimately, the result of everything we have considered is the national cultures that we have now. And culture, it must be understood, is not inherited genetically. A very important thesis. Culture is not inherited genetically. And everything mentioned in this point 3 stabilizes culture and protects it from dilution. These are the factors. And it should be highlighted here in red as a general conclusion that culture is carried not by the biological population, but by the social organization of the biological population. Culture is carried not by the biological population, but by the social organization of the biological population. You will not find such a formulation of the question in any textbook. Culture, thus, is a factor of the environment that influences people. Therefore, as a factor of the environment, it exerts its pressure, that is, control over the populations of all species. On humans, including the biocenosis as a whole, well, examples are there, like culture. Here you see the extermination of animals, and so to speak, the destruction of food chains as well. On humans, wars, meaning destroy people, there is a whole genocide, and so on. Culture influences the biocenosis as a whole. So, if the rates of change, and now remember what we discussed, the ratio of these frequencies, how they exert a pressing factor on a particular biological species. If this biological species cannot adapt, if the rates of change in cultural parameters are low, then the genotype of the population will be forced to adapt to the most stable parameters of culture, that is food, clothing, housing, rituals, religions, and so on. And this will be reflected in the reclamation of the matrix of possibilities. That is, if there is a genetically determined potential and this matrix exists, then culture will influence the realization of the genetically determined potential of the matrix. What conclusions can be drawn from this? The development of culture affects the reproduction of generations of humanity. The development of culture affects the reproduction of generations of humanity. Animals are limited only by natural and geographical factors. A person, unlike animals, is enclosed by culture based on characteristics. National, class, elite, mafia, and so on. Unlike animals. Therefore, the imposition of a foreign culture on a people always meets with resistance. In the cultural traditions of a people's social organization, customs, systems of governance, and relationships between people, that is, you impose and they resist. In the cumulative matrix of genetically determined potential capabilities and predispositions of a people, and in external social factors, that is, God exists. Therefore, he also has an influence on these factors. So, based on this, the so-called cultural exchange and what we called war as a method of cultural cooperation rarely brings new content to the life of a people. Well, examples like the Eskimos, no matter how they were integrated, and the Indians, they live as they always have, that is, attempts to impose a foreign culture on them, are rejected. Therefore, based on this and everything we have discussed, the eradication of undesirable cultures in human history has always been accompanied by genocide. Narcotic, economic, various state cultural programs, and so on. In relation to us, our culture is undesirable to the conquerors. You know, a Cold War is being waged against our country. Therefore, there is outright genocide against us, against our people, and narcotics. Look, they have flooded the children with vodka and beer. They are getting them drunk, and so on. This means economic genocide. We are the richest country on planet Earth. We have everything. And therefore, our people are impoverished, while those who have no natural resources are thriving at our expense. Various programs, mindless reforms are being carried out. That is, through the hands of our thoughtless democratizers, genocides are being unleashed, the destruction of our own country and our own people. About speech and thinking from the perspective of the concept of public safety of dead water. What points are important to understand here? First, the emergence of the childhood period is due to the increase in the volume of non-genetic information. We talked about how a cat learns something from its parents, like meowing, and a dog barks, and so on. That's it. But a human needs to master books, what has been learned before him, and so on. Therefore, speech is an informational system for encoding the object-image thinking of a person. Here, a little person is drawn, and he has receptors. So eyes, ears, you see, nose, mouth, and so on. And he looks, the sun, birds, trees are growing. He perceives all of this, the smells and all these phenomena, not only natural phenomena, but also in social life, strikes, wars. He endows speech with meaning, saying sun, tree, hot, birds are singing. So to speak, he endows everything around him with words, unlike what? But animals only say meow. The cat, bark, bark, and so on. That is, a person began to talk about what he could not express clearly with his body. Well, the cat shows with its body as a personal example, while a speaking teacher is already progress, so to speak. Therefore, when you see someone waving their hands, this is, well, in particular Yeltsin. Remember, he says, I will catch that. That is, someone who cannot express their thoughts starts waving their hands. This is a sign of the inability to clearly articulate the phenomena that surround a person. Speech has provided the opportunity to transmit skills learned from ancestors. That is, one generation masters something and passes it on to the new one. Thus, the new generation has mastered what the old one had and also acquired more during its lifetime. It also passes on to its ancestors and the volume outside of genetic, that is, social. The information grew during that time. And now, in particular, this factor leads to teachers saying that one must study in school for 12 years, not 10. And so on. The presence of hands along with speech, anticipating possible options, premeditating actions, and so on. All of this allowed humans to begin defending themselves against the pressures of their natural environment by creating an artificial habitat. That is, animals could not defend themselves. They could only build a nest at best, and so on. But humans began to build houses. First huts, then wooden structures, then concrete ones. Now you see these skyscrapers and so on. So first fires, then, so to speak, stoves now, radiators, and so on. Over time, the artificial environment began to suppress the natural environment. First in the life of an individual and then on a planetary scale. That is, now look at the means of transportation, such as airplanes, locomotives, rails, and so on. That is, the environment and the technocratic civilization began to suppress all these natural conditions in which humans lived before. Well, whether this is good or bad, we have already discussed. We need to determine what is good and what is bad. These questions should be raised. Depending on that, it should be considered through the lens of, by the way. And through the prism of what contributes to the mastery of genetically determined human potential and what does not, there is the answer to the question in the end. Therefore, no one refuses to go back to wearing loincloths and dancing around palm trees with bananas. This is, of course, nonsense. But at the same time, it is necessary to understand that there are certain things that suppress human genetics. They do not contribute to the mastery of what is inherent in a person. Therefore, these things need to be reviewed, how to correct them, and decisions need to be made in accordance with what? Aligning your decision with God, that is, entering into a relationship with Him. But here is an important point. Having gained the ability for abstract logical thinking, a person has also gained the ability to lie and self-deceive. Research has shown that a person lies with the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is not capable of it. What I just said is a very important point. It means that what we have considered, the word is a measure, a code, and so on. So if a person looks at some phenomenon, they understand that it is so. But with words, he endows this phenomenon in the way he needs. In other words, he is lying, figuratively speaking. In this way, he creates informational influences on others that do not correspond to what is around. That is, he introduces inversion into the enterprise of the surrounding world. The languages of all peoples are part of the universal measure. Therefore, the cause of truth for everyone is the right cause. Just imagine if Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin had said during the war, this cause is left, enemy. It is hard to imagine that, right? But our Duganovites openly say, and we are leftists. Can you imagine? And they consider themselves heirs, including Stalin. That is, it is pure nonsense. Because, remember, the right cause means the right power, right truth from this word. And the left cause is always deceitful. Left money, left goods, a man went to the left. That is, all this left cause is deceitful. But ours, they are leftists. And the right ones, who are actually doing the SP Sots, Nemtsov, and so on, they are doing the right cause. It is pure legalism. And they defend and say, well, okay, if these ones are lying, everything is clear with them, with Nemtsov, Kakamata, and others. But as for what concerns those who talk about justice, in particular the Zhuganovites, this is a lie. So, what should we start from here? There are essentially two concepts. One concept of people's lives is good, righteous, yes, a correct concept, and there is an honest, unjust, unrighteous concept. So, those supporters of the unrighteous concept who at least speak openly, like Chubais and so on, yes, they say, we will dominate and so on, they are at least obvious. Much more dangerous are those who, under the guise of supposedly doing the right thing, create false deeds. These are precisely the Trotskyists. And the Zhuganovites are not right-wing at all, along with all these Marxists. This is exactly what Karl Marx invented, a doctrine that will never lead to communism. And we have already examined three sources, three components of Marxism. We will return to this and talk about it. So why am I telling all this? A lie is always part of another matter, and the one who lies, even if the lie is for good, it is always bad. Therefore, one must always tell the truth in all cases, because a lie is always an unrighteous act. This means that our attitude towards everyone who does not know dead water is decreasing. In particular, when you encounter them, well, do you know about dead water? They all say, no, I haven't heard, I don't know. But we know for sure, that is, you have watched, read. And everyone who comes to us says, please evaluate us. How do you feel about this? We have criticism on almost all issues. But why is there silence regarding dead water? They are silent. The ability to lie is the ability to misrepresent objective reality in others. Well, we have already talked about this. That is, it is a distortion or destruction of someone else's personal measure. In other words, one should never lie. And so the conclusions from what we have discussed, the ability to lie and self-deception, has also become a factor in the development of culture. A very important point. The ability to lie and self-deception has become a factor in the development of culture. And unfortunately, a leading factor, and you can see what we are currently observing. Indeed, our rulers and leaders lie brazenly. The people understand this, but they, as the saying goes, have written all God's due in their eyes. That is, they lie brazenly, and everyone understands, meaning we live in a society of lies, generally speaking. And this factor of lies has become a factor in the development of culture, and consequently a factor of the global historical process. And the historical process is the process of cultural development in the global evolutionary development of the biosphere. A global evolutionary process, that is, a factor in the development of the biosphere. And since the culture is entirely based on lies, it has its own effects. A negative impact on the development of the biosphere of planet Earth. And this has led to a global ecological crisis in particular, and to all other crises. What all scientists now call a global systemic crisis, a crisis in everything. And the factor is, well, lies. We have examined the global historical process, and now, after a break, we will begin to consider the totalitarian society, that is, how social relations developed and were constructed in the global historical process.